Jai Hind everyone. My name is Manoj Kumar, Department in Computer Science and Engineering, Ajay Kumar Garg Engineering College. Today topic is transaction. What is transaction? Transaction is basically outline of the transaction, brief of transaction, transaction concept, transaction state, and concurrent execution, serializability, recoverability, implementation of isolation, and transaction definition in the SQL, structure query language, testing for the serializability. First, what is transaction? Transaction concept. A transaction is a unit program. Transaction is a unit program that access and possible the data in a various data items. For example, for transaction is a basically two account. First is A account and second is a B account. First transaction transfer the A account to B account is 50 rupees. 50 rupees. So first operation in transaction is a read operation. Read A, first account number is A, and transfer the amount 50 rupees. A equal to A minus 50, and then write the first account, write B, and next account is B. B is read B, and operation is B equal to B plus 50, and write operation. This concept is known as transaction. Transaction is basically some issues, failure a various kind of hardware problem, system crash, and concurrent execution, multiple transaction. Transaction basically account A transfer the 50 amount, read A equal to A minus 50, and write B, then read B, and B equal to B plus 50, and write B. Transaction property, atomicity requirement. Atomicity means transaction step 3rd and 6 are write the database without the failure. And durability means sum of account A plus account B after the transaction. A plus B both are same. This also called durability. Consistency, database unchanged the execution of the transaction. Sum of A plus B equal to sum of B plus B before transaction and after transaction. And transaction consistency, basically two types. First is implicit integrated constraint. Sum balance all the accounts minus and loan of the amount must be equal to cash in hand. A transaction should trace the consistent database. During the transaction, database may be temporarily inconsistent. And third point, when the transaction is a successfully, data must be consistent. Isolation means concurrent execution or parallel execution. Isolation means concurrent execution or transaction. Concurrent execution or transaction is isolation. First is T1 transaction and second is T2 transaction. T1 transaction are executed but cannot be affect the T2 transaction. This process is known as concurrent execution or parallel execution. For example, example is same. A account transfer the 50 rupees in B account, and instruction read A equal to A minus B, and B write A, read B, B equal to B plus 50, and write B. And T2 transaction, read A, write B and print A plus B. Both T1 and T2 are concurrent execution. This is known as isolation of the transaction. ACID property. ACID property. ACID property. ACID property means ACID property is a transaction property. A transaction is a unit program that access and possible the update the various data item to preserve the integrity of the database must be ensured. First is atomicity. A for atomicity and C for consistency and I for isolation of the transaction, and D stands for durability of the transaction. So first atomicity, either all operation of the transaction are properly reflected in the database or once, and consistency, execution of the transaction in isolation in the consistent of the database. Isolation, all the multiple transaction may be executed in the concurrently for the database. And durability, after the transaction completed the successfully, do not change the other failure of the system, other failure of the database. Transaction state basically five state. First is active state, second is partial committed, third is failed state, and fourth is aborted state, and fifth is committed state. State diagram, transaction state diagram, first is active state, and second is partial state, and third is failed state, fourth is committed and aborted state. Active state, initial state, the transaction may be state while they executing. Next state is partial state. Partial state means final state has been executed. Failed state, normal execution cannot be longer the proceed. Aborted state, after the transaction has been rolled back of the database, restore the state of the transaction. And last is committed, is database is successfully completed. State diagram, active state, start the transaction, execution of the transaction. Fail the state, then roll back the transaction, and partial committed and committed. Concurrent execution, multiple transaction allow in the concurrent in the system. Advantage of the concurrency of the transaction, increase the processor time and maximum utilization of the memory, leading better the transaction throughput. One transaction can be using the CPU processor while the other transaction read the write operation of the same disk memory. Reduce the average response time. Next, advantage concurrency, control schema, mechanism of the achieve the isolation. Isolation means concurrent execution, multiple transaction. Non-serial schedule, that is a control the interaction among the concurrent transaction order to prevent them from the restore of the concurrency of the database. Schedule of the transaction, basically schedule the sequence of instruction thus that specify the particular sequence in which instruction of the concurrent transaction are executed of the transaction. First transaction T1 and second transaction T2 and third is transaction T3. Arrange the particular sequence, this is known as schedule. Arrange the particular sequence, this is known as schedule. Transaction that successfully complete the execution of the commit instruction, the last statement, default the transaction, assume the execute the commit instruction. Sorry, a last step transaction. Sorry, transaction fail the successfully complete the execution about the instruction, a last statement. Schedule 1 for 2 transaction, schedule S, T1 transaction and T2 transaction. T1 are completed the commit state, and T2 after the completed the this schedule are known as serial schedule. Serial means T1 transaction is first executed, then they executed the second transaction T2. First T1 is completed, after T2 are completed. And second example of the serial schedule, first T2 are committed, then T1 are committed. Serial is T2, then T1. Next example, the non-serial schedule, equivalent serial schedule. T1 T2 transaction, the T1 and T2 transaction, T1 some instruction are executed, then the T2 are executed, then T1 are executed, then T2 are executed. This schedule is known as non-serial schedule. Non-serial schedule. Next example, first is T1 are executed, then T2 are executed, then T1 are completed, then T2 are completed. This is known as conflict serializable या non-serial schedule. Serializability, basic serializability. A possible concurrent execution schedule is serializable or not, are equivalent a serial schedule. This is known as serializability. Serializability basically 2 types. First is conflict serializable and second is view serializable. View serializable, they ignore the operation read and write instruction and assume the transaction may be performed the arbitrary computation of the database in a local buffer and between the read and write operation. And conflict instruction basically 4 condition. First transaction is read and second transaction is read. T1 is read, after T2 is read and T2 is read. This is known as non-conflict instruction. And second condition is first is read, after second is write, is same data item Q and same data item Q is write in T2 transaction. This known as a conflict instruction. And third condition is first transaction is write, is same data item Q and second transaction is read, same data item capital Q. This is a conflict instruction. And last 4th condition is T1 transaction is write capital Q and same data item, T2 is write. This is a known as conflict instruction. Conflict serializable. A schedule S can be transferred into schedule S by the series of swapping non-conflict instruction. S and S dash are a conflict equivalent. Conflict equivalent serial schedule. The conflict equivalent is a serial schedule. First is a T1 transaction and second is teaching two operation read and write, and next T2 transaction read and write, and next T1 transaction read and write and read and write. After the swapping non-conflict serial schedule, conflict instruction. After the swapping, this is known as a serial schedule. And conflicts serializability, other example, read operation, and fourth operation is write operation, and write operation. The serial schedule are T3 execution of the, after that T3 is T4 are executed. This known as a serial schedule. View serializability. Two types serializability: conflicts serializable and second is view serializable. View serializable means three condition: if the schedule S transaction Ti a initial read of any data items Q, and second operation T1 are executed the read operation and the value of data items are the same write operation. Intermediate instruction is write operation, and third condition final write operation perform the same data items. Basically, a three condition is a view serializable. This is example of the view serializable. A schedule is a view serializable if a view equivalent a serial schedule. Initial read data items and intermediate write data item and final write data item of transaction 29, and intermediate write the transaction is 28, and initial read is transaction is 27. And other notation of the serializability, other notation of first T1 transaction, then T2 transaction, T1 and T2. This is known as serializability. And testing for the serializability, basically graph, it is used by the graph G equal to V and E. V equal to vertices and E equal to edges of graph, and transaction number is a transaction state. This is also known as transaction precedence graph. And transaction precedence graph, T1 is state, T1 is transaction state with vertices, and A is connected by the three condition non-conflict serializable. This type of other test type, the other example of the conflict serializable is serializable T1, T2, T3 and T4 some transaction T1 to Tj and Ti to Tk and Tk to Tm. This type transaction is known as non-conflict conflict serializable. No cycle are found. This is known as conflict serializable. Thank you.